They thought that by humiliating me in front of hundreds of colleagues, I'd disappear quietly into the night. What they didn't know was that with just one document, one number, I could ignite $1 million scandal that would drag the entire executive team into the abyss. And when that moment came, I didn't tremble. I saw with perfect clarity this would be their ending, not mine. They handed me the matches the day they tried to bury me alive. My name is Rachel Carter, and until 3:45 p.m. on that Tuesday afternoon, I was the Deputy Director of Internal Audit at Halberton Capital. 12 years of my life poured into those gleaming towers on Madison Avenue. 12 years of catching fraud before it could metastasize, of being the watchdog nobody wanted but everyone needed. That was before James Whitaker decided to make an example of me. The all-hands meeting was supposed to be routine quarterly earnings, new initiatives, the usual corporate theater, 500 employees packed into the main conference hall. Another 1,000 dialed in remotely. I sat in my usual spot, third row from the front, notebook open, pen ready. I should have noticed the way James's eyes found me when he took the podium, should have recognized the predator's stillness before the strike. "Before we begin," James said, his voice carrying that practiced executive warmth that never reached his eyes, "we need to address a serious matter of accountability." The room shifted, phones lowered, side conversations died. As CFO, I'm responsible for ensuring every department operates at peak efficiency. Unfortunately, not everyone shares that commitment. He clicked to a slide. My department's name blazed across the screen in accusatory red. Our internal audit division, under Deputy Director Rachel Carter's leadership, has cost this company $3.7 million in failed compliance measures. My blood turned to ice water. The number was fabricated. Impossible. My team had saved the company twice that amount just last quarter by catching vendor fraud, but the gasps around me said the damage was already done. "Ms. Carter," James's voice boomed through the wireless mic. "Would you stand, please?" Every muscle in my body screamed to run, but running would be admitting guilt. I stood, feeling 500 pairs of eyes drilling into my back. The remote viewers would be getting a perfect camera angle of my humiliation. It always live-streamed these meetings. "Your negligence in the Morrison account audit alone cost us a critical merger opportunity." Lie. "Your team's delays in processing compliance reports resulted in federal penalties." Lie. "And most egregiously, your failure to identify internal discrepancies has put our entire audit certification at risk." The biggest lie of all, I'd identified discrepancies all right, $5 million worth, all leading back to his office. "Effective immediately. You're being placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation." The words hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Someone behind me whispered, "Holy shit." Another person was already typing, probably updating their LinkedIn, distancing themselves from the contamination of my failure. "Security will escort you to clear your office," James continued, his tone now dripping with false regret. "We cannot tolerate this level of incompetence at Halberton Capital." 2 security guards were already walking down the aisle toward me, not the friendly guys from the lobby who knew my coffee order, but the serious ones from the executive floor, the ones they used for terminations. I gathered my notebook with steady hands, though inside I was screaming. As I walked up that aisle, colleagues I'd worked with for years suddenly found their phones fascinating. Marina from compliance, who'd cried in my office during her divorce, stared at her lap. Derek from trading, whose son I'd helped get an internship, turned his chair away. The walk to my office felt like a funeral procession. The security guards flanked me, their presence announcing my shame to everyone we passed. By the time we reached my door, a cardboard box was already waiting. 12 years reduced to a container the size of a microwave. They watched as I packed, the photo from my Harvard graduation, the crystal paperweight from winning Auditor of the Year 3 times running, the forensic accounting textbooks I'd referenced so often their spines were cracked. My hands moved mechanically while my mind raced through what James had just done. This wasn't just a termination, it was a public execution designed to destroy my reputation so thoroughly that anything I said afterward would be dismissed as bitter retaliation. But James had made one critical error. In his arrogance, He'd forgotten that I'd spent 12 years learning every financial secret this company had, including his. The elevator down felt like a descent into hell. 37 floors of shame, with the security guards standing close enough that I could smell their cheap cologne mixing with my humiliation. When we hit the lobby, it was 4:23 p.m., rush hour for office gossip. I could already see people checking their phones, probably reading the company-wide email James had undoubtedly sent the moment I left the conference hall. Outside, Manhattan hit me with its typical April coldness, both in weather and indifference. I stood on the sidewalk, cardboard box cutting into my arms, watching my former colleagues stream out for coffee breaks. They parted around me like I was contagious. Sarah from HR actually crossed the street to avoid eye contact. We'd had lunch together just yesterday. My phone buzzed incessantly. I didn't need to look to know what was happening. The corporate gossip machine was in overdrive. By tomorrow, my name would be toxic across every financial firm in the city. James had made sure of that with his very public execution. The taxi ride home to my Upper West Side apartment was a blur of rage and disbelief. 12 years. 12 years of 60-hour weeks, of catching million-dollar discrepancies that saved executives' asses, of being the one they called at 11 p.m. on Sundays when something didn't add up. I'd missed birthdays, canceled vacations, lost relationships, all for a company that just discarded me like infected waste. My apartment felt foreign when I entered, too quiet for 4:50 p.m. on a Tuesday. I should have been in back-to-back meetings right now, not standing in my kitchen with a box of professional debris. I set it on the counter and finally looked at my phone. 43 messages, most from recruiters suddenly withdrawing interest, 3 from colleagues expressing shock, but keeping distance, 1 from my mother asking if I was okay. News traveled fast in the digital age. But there was one message that made me stop cold. From Marcus in a T, sent from his personal email. Check your personal drive. Uploaded everything before they locked you out. They're already scrubbing your files? Marcus had been my silent ally for years, the one who'd helped me track digital footprints when official channels stonewalled. I opened my laptop, hands shaking slightly as I logged into my personal cloud storage. There it was, 2 gigabytes of everything I'd accumulated. Reports, emails, spreadsheets, all the evidence I'd gathered about the irregularities in James's department. I poured myself a whiskey Macallan 18-year. Because if there was ever a time for the good stuff, it was now, and began reading through the files with fresh eyes, without the constant pressure of being inside the system. Patterns emerged that I'd been too overwhelmed to fully connect before. The rage that had been boiling in my chest crystallized into something colder, sharper. They thought they'd neutralized me with public humiliation. They thought I'd slink away, too devastated to fight back. But they'd forgotten who I was, someone who'd spent over a decade learning to follow money like blood trails. My phone rang. An unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Ms. Carter. The voice was unfamiliar, professional. My name is David Sterling from Sterling Associates. I specialize in whistleblower cases. How did you... Your termination is already making rounds in certain circles, the way it was handled. Let's say it raised some eyebrows among those of us who know how these things usually go down. I stayed silent, processing. I'll be direct, he continued. When a CFO publicly destroys an audit director with fabricated numbers, it's usually because that director was getting too close to something. I'd like to discuss your options. I'm listening. Not over the phone. Tomorrow. 10 a.m. My office. I'll send you the address. And Ms. Carter, bring everything you have. Everything. After he hung up, I sat in my darkening apartment, the Manhattan skyline beginning to twinkle outside my window. The city that never sleeps was starting its night shift, and I was no longer part of its corporate machinery. But maybe that was exactly where I needed to be outside the system, where I could finally see it clearly. The whiskey burned pleasantly as I opened my laptop again and began organizing files. James Whitaker thought he'd destroyed me today. He thought that public humiliation was the worst thing that could happen to someone like me. He had no idea what was coming. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I dove deep into the files Marcus had saved, and what I found was a masterclass in corporate fraud. The pattern was elegant in its deception, horrifying in its scope. It started with the Reserve Risk Fund, a legitimate pool meant to cover potential losses from bad investments, but James had been using it as his personal slush fund, moving money in and out to cover trading losses before quarterly reports. $5 million had vanished over 18 months, hidden through a shell game of internal transfers and fabricated vendor payments. The smoking gun was in the email chains. James had been sloppy, probably because he thought his position made him untouchable. Messages to his deputy, Kevin Morrison, explicitly directing him to adjust the reserve allocations and ensure the Q3 numbers align with projections. One email from 11:47 p.m. last December was particularly damning. Move another 1.2 M from reserves. Mark it as system infrastructure upgrades. The board doesn't look at IT expenses. But it was the attached spreadsheets that made my blood run cold. They showed 2 sets of books, the real numbers and the sanitized versions presented to the board. The discrepancies weren't just criminal. They were systematic fraud that went back 3 years. I'd flagged these issues 6 months ago in a formal report to James. His response had been to restrict my access to financial systems and reassign my best auditors to other departments. I'd sent follow-up emails, CCing the head of compliance. Those emails had mysteriously vanished from the company servers, but I'd learned long ago to BCC my personal account on sensitive matters. At 3:12 a.m., I found the thread that connected everything. A series of transfers totaling $5.3 million to Whitaker Holdings, LLC, a company registered in Delaware with James's wife as the sole director. The money had been laundered through 3 different vendor accounts, all approved by James himself, all for services never rendered. I sat back in my chair, the weight of what I held crushing and exhilarating simultaneously. This wasn't just evidence of misconduct. It was proof of embezzlement grand enough to trigger federal investigation, the kind that ended with handcuffs and perp walks. My laptop screen glowed in the darkness of my apartment as I methodically organized everything into a single encrypted folder: financial records, email chains, wire transfer confirmations, board presentations versus actual numbers, a prosecutor's dream package. But I also knew how these things usually played out. Whistleblowers got buried in legal fees while corporations deployed armies of lawyers. The David Sterlings of the world took their 30% and moved on while the whistleblower became unemployable. I needed to be smarter. I created 3 copies of everything, one on a physical drive that went into my safety deposit box at 4:45 a.m. when the bank opened, one uploaded to an encrypted cloud service based in Switzerland, and one that I spent the early morning hours preparing for strategic deployment. The financial journalists I'd cultivated relationships with over the years, the ones who'd called me off the record for insights into market trends, they would be interested in this, but not yet. First, I needed legal protection. As dawn broke over Manhattan, painting my apartment in shades of gold and shadow, I pulled up the SEC's whistleblower submission portal. The government offered rewards for information leading to successful enforcement actions, typically 10 to 30% of monetary sanctions collected. With $5 million in fraud, that could mean a 7-figure payout. More importantly, it offered protection against retaliation, though that ship had already sailed. I began drafting my submission, careful to be precise but not revealing everything, enough to get their attention, not enough to show my full hand. As I typed, I thought about everyone still at Halberton, the employees whose retirement funds were invested in company stock, unaware their CFO was cooking the books, the junior auditors who'd be blamed when this eventually exploded, the shareholders being deceived every quarter. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Heard about yesterday. James overplayed. Some of us remember who really caught the Patterson fraud. Coffee later. Anonymous friend. I didn't respond. Trust was a luxury I couldn't afford anymore. But it was interesting that cracks were already forming in James's narrative. By the time I needed to leave for David Sterling's office, I had everything organized. The evidence was cataloged, cross-referenced, and ready for war. James Whitaker had given me the greatest gift possible when he publicly humiliated me. He'd freed me from any obligation to handle this quietly. He'd made this personal. Now I was going to make it terminal. David Sterling's office occupied the 40th floor of a building that screamed old money and discretion, the kind of place where careers were made and destroyed over leather-bound contracts and $100-an-ounce scotch. His assistant, a woman who looked like she could stare down a federal judge, led me to a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the financial district. Sterling himself was not what I expected. Late 50s, wearing jeans and a blazer instead of the typical power suit, with eyes that had seen enough corporate malfeasance to fill a library. He didn't shake my hand. He studied me for a long moment before speaking. "Show me what you have." For the next 2 hours, I walked him through everything: the fraudulent transfers, the dual bookkeeping, the deleted emails I'd preserved, the shell company in Delaware. He interrupted only to ask for clarification on specific transactions. His assistant took notes on a legal pad. Old school. No digital trail. When I finished, Sterling leaned back in his chair. "This is a federal case. Wire fraud, securities fraud, embezzlement. James Whitaker is looking at 15 to 20 years if convicted. If each. Halberton will throw 8 figures at defending him. They can't afford not to if he goes down. The SEC will crawl through every transaction for the past decade. Share price would crater. They'll claim you're a disgruntled employee fabricating evidence. Everything is documented." "I know. That's why you're here." He pulled out a legal pad of his own. "Here's what we're going to do. First, we file with the SEC's whistleblower office. That starts the clock and gives you federal protection. Second, we prepare packages for the Southern District of New York. They love cases like this. Third, and this is crucial, we control the narrative." Meaning we don't dump everything at once. We let it bleed out strategically. First, the SEC gets enough to open an investigation. That leaks it always does. Halberton's stock takes a hit. The board starts asking questions. Then, we feed select information to journalists. Not the whole story. Just enough to keep the pressure building. I thought about the journalists' contacts in my phone. Rebecca Turner at the Wall Street Journal. Michael Reeves at the Financial Times. They'd kill for this story. "Meanwhile," Sterling continued, "James will panic. Men like him always do. He'll try to cover his tracks, move money, delete files. Every action he takes now becomes additional evidence of consciousness of guilt. We document everything." "What about Halberton coming after me?" "They already have. Your reputation is torched. But here's the thing, once the SEC investigation goes public, you transform from disgruntled employee to protected whistleblower. Every action they've taken against you becomes potential retaliation. That's additional damages." His assistant slid a retainer agreement across the table. "We work on contingency, 25% of any whistleblower award, 30% of any civil settlement. You pay nothing up front." I read through the agreement carefully. Old habits die hard. "What's the timeline?" "SEC filing today. They have to respond within 30 days. But with evidence this solid, I expect movement within a week. Press strategy starts once we get confirmation the investigation is active. Figure 3 to 4 weeks before this becomes public knowledge." 3 to 4 weeks. James would go about his life, thinking he'd won, while the machinery of justice slowly spun up around him. "There's one more thing," I said, pulling out a folder I'd kept separate. 3 other executives signed off on these fraudulent reports. They knew. Sterling's smile was sharp as a blade. "Better and better. RICO predicates. This just became a conspiracy case." We spent another hour going through details, which documents to submit immediately, which to hold back, how to maintain security. Sterling gave me a burner phone for our communications, where to store physical copies of evidence. By noon, we'd submitted the initial SEC complaint online, with supporting documentation sent via encrypted channels. Walking out of Sterling's office, I felt something I hadn't experienced in days. Control. James had tried to destroy me with shame and isolation, but he'd failed to understand that shame only works if you accept it. And isolation, that just gave me time to build my case without interference. I took a taxi to my bank and deposited the retainer agreement in my safety box, next to the hard drives. Then I went home and did something I hadn't done in years. I turned off my phone and took a bath at 2 p.m. As I soaked in the tub, I thought about James in his corner office, probably celebrating his victory. He had no idea that the fuse was already lit. The explosion was coming, and when it did, I'd have a front row seat to watch everything he'd built turn to ash. The hunter had become the hunted. He just didn't know it yet. 3 weeks of silence. 3 weeks of watching Halberton's stock price climb while James played the victorious executive. Then, at 9:15 a.m. on a Thursday, Sterling called the burner phone. The SEC just opened a formal investigation. They're sending a team to Halberton tomorrow morning. Time to light the match. I'd been preparing for this moment. The package for Rebecca Turner at the Wall Street Journal was already assembled, just enough documentation to prove the story was real, not enough to compromise the federal investigation. I messaged her from an encrypted app. Major financial scandal at Halberton Capital. SEC investigating. Documents attached. More to come. Her response was immediate. Holy shit! Verifying now? By 2 p.m., I was watching the first dominoes fall from my apartment. The WSJ website banner, exclusive SEC, opens investigation into Halberton Capital's financial reporting. The article was careful, factual, but devastating. It mentioned potential irregularities in reserve fund management and questions about executive oversight. No names yet, but anyone inside Halberton would know exactly who managed those funds. My regular phone exploded with messages. Former colleagues suddenly remembered I existed. I ignored them all except one from Marcus. Watching the fireworks. They're in full panic mode. James called an emergency meeting. The stock market reacted instantly. Halberton dropped 12% in after-hours trading. By the next morning, it was down 18%. Bloomberg, Reuters, and CNBC had picked up the story. The financial press smelled blood in the water. Then came Phase 2. I leaked the Delaware shell company information to Michael Reeves at the Financial Times. Not the full details, just enough. Halberton CFO James Whitaker linked to suspicious vendor payments through Delaware LLC. This time, I didn't have to wait long. The FT published at 6 a.m. London time, 1 a.m. in New York. By the time Manhattan woke up, James Whitaker's name was trending on financial Twitter. CFO at center of Halberton scandal, screamed the headlines. Sterling called at 7:30 a.m. Beautiful work. The SEC just expanded their investigation. They're seizing documents today. My contact says they're particularly interested in executive communications from the past 3 years. I smiled, thinking of all those emails James thought he'd deleted. The ones where he explicitly instructed subordinates to falsify reports. The ones I'd meticulously preserved. The next leak went to ProPublica, the nonprofit investigative outlet. They got the smoking gun, the email where James instructed Kevin Morrison to move $1.2 million from reserves and market his IT infrastructure. The story published at noon with the actual email embedded in the article. This time, Halberton couldn't stay silent. They released a statement at 3 p.m. Halberton Capital is cooperating fully with the SEC investigation. We are committed to the highest standards of financial integrity. CFO James Whitaker has our complete confidence. Complete confidence. I actually laughed out loud. In corporate speak, that was the kiss of death. They were already distancing themselves, setting him up as the fall guy if needed. But James wasn't going down without a fight. At 4:20 p.m., a hit piece appeared on a financial blog known for publishing corporate PR disguised as journalism. Disgruntled former employee may be behind Halberton leaks. It painted me as unstable, incompetent, vindictive. They'd even found an old photo from a company party where I had a glass of wine in my hand, trying to imply I had drinking problems. Sterling had warned me this would happen. Let them punch themselves out, he'd said. Every attack they make now becomes evidence of retaliation. I didn't respond. Instead, I sent Rebecca Turner the crown jewel documentation showing $5.3 million transferred to Whitaker Holdings, LLC. The full paper trail, wire transfers, approval signatures, the works. The WSJ held it for a day, verifying every detail. Then they published a front-page investigation. Halberton's CFO allegedly diverted $5.3 million to personal company. The article was devastating, laying out the entire scheme with forensic precision. They'd even found Whitaker Holdings registration documents, confirming James's wife as the sole director. The board called an emergency meeting at 8 p.m. By 10 p.m., news leaked that they'd hired an external law firm to conduct an independent investigation. By midnight, 3 institutional investors had announced they were reassessing their Halberton positions. I sat in my dark apartment, watching the city lights twinkle, monitoring the news feeds on my laptop. Every refresh brought new developments. Financial Twitter was in meltdown. Halberton employees were updating LinkedIn profiles. The company's Glassdoor page was being bombed with insider revelations. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "You destroyed everything. You vindictive bitch. You'll pay for this." I knew that writing style. James was cracking. Good. The pressure was just beginning. Sterling texted on the burner. "DOJ just entered the chat. Criminal investigation opening Monday. Time to watch the House of Cards fall." $5 million. That's what James had stolen. But the damage to Halberton was already approaching $500 million in lost market value. And we weren't done yet. James went on the offensive like a wounded animal. Monday morning, 6 a.m. His lawyers released a statement. "These allegations are fabricated by a terminated employee with a history of performance issues. Ms. Carter was dismissed for gross incompetence that cost Halberton millions. This is clearly retaliation for her justified termination." They attached selective portions of my personnel file, a negative review from 5 years ago, a dispute with a colleague about audit procedures, anything they could spin. They conveniently omitted my 3 Auditor of the Year awards and the commendations from the board for catching the Patterson fraud. Sterling was ready. By 8 a.m., we'd filed a formal retaliation complaint with the Department of Labor. By 9 a.m., my full personnel file mysteriously appeared on WikiLeaks, showing years of stellar reviews and James's own signature on my last performance bonus. The narrative war had begun. But James made a critical error. In his desperation